Thank you very much. I would like to ask Bob a question after his fascinating presentation. I certainly agree with you that one of the major problems of our time is the lack of a shared worldview, what you call an ontology or metaphysics. And the two major worldviews that we have are, on the one hand, a naturalistic theory that cannot render justice to the fact that there is such a thing as a mind that must be more than an epiphenomenon of electrochemical processes in our brain, otherwise we are not able to grasp truth if it's only that. And on the other hand, we have a radical constructivism in the social sciences that ultimately destroys any concept of truth and therefore also destroys any idea that you have a moral obligation to say the truth, because your constructions are your truth and the other constructions are the fake news. So it is really important to get to an agreement on some metaphysical issues in order to unite people. On the other hand, and that is my question to you, if you study the history of religious and philosophical thought in the last centuries, one of the central points expressed, for example, by Kant was, we will not agree on metaphysical issues because they're extraordinarily complex, but we have a chance to agree on moral issues. Let's therefore detach the moral discourse from the intricacies of metaphysical discourse, because it's more likely that we'll get to an agreement on these issues. And so my question to you is, is your claim that it makes only sense to try to forge moral consensus if we have also a metaphysical consensus on the nature of reality, on spiritual principles, or is it only an additional issue that you are personally interested in?
Let me say first, it's with trepidation that I even began a colloquy with a distinguished philosopher on such things, speaking as a layman. Having said that, I'll jump in and speak as a layman. We are at the Fetzer Institute beginning to work with a number of academic partners to say what emerges if we integrate in the most sophisticated way of knowing, or the way we can, the multiple ways of knowing, on the proposition that the scientific way of knowing provides a powerful tool to probe physical reality, but as you say, cannot begin to give a full account of reality, including the interior dimension of human experience. So the scientists have to be quite humble in recognizing we must be open to the possibility that there is a dimension of reality beyond the physical, and we also have to acknowledge our own limitations. And that seems to me to open the field for exploring the limits and capacities of both the rational and the spiritual intuitive way of probing the transcendent, probing whether there is, and if there is, what's the nature of transcendent reality. And I think that part of that inquiry is precisely the question of objective moral value. And so I think once we've opened the field, we have to recognize that the place where humanity has, for the longest period of time and most intensely, used that spiritual way of knowing to probe the non-material dimension of reality is within the great faith traditions, and I commented on this. Actually, I would add to your competing worldviews a third worldview of a very different kind, which is the extremist religious worldview. We need a place to stand to push back on all of these worldviews, and I think an epistemology that recognizes that the spiritual way of knowing is a through-a-glass darkly way of knowing that recognizes that transcendence is shrouded in mystery, and therefore the religious extremist that tells us precisely what we need to believe about the divine just hasn't understood the spiritual way of knowing. But then, having said that, celebrate the fact that, or lift up, name the fact that the traditions have at least all agreed on the proposition there is a transcendent dimension of reality, and it has a moral core. And it seems to me that a sophisticated articulation of that position is urgently needed. Thank you.
So this may come as a naive suggestion, but I'm really fixated on the action part of ethics in action. And I love that we're going to have an eloquent statement. I love that we're all going to go back and echo. But the community organizer in me says that we have a lot of power in this room, and we haven't even begun to either understand it or harness it. If I were thinking about the gathering, just all my colleagues even around me from the faith communities, standing in front of St. Peter's, together, saying something, visual, something we can say. Obviously, the faith over fear, fabulous. But we're here, and I think there's a commonality of why we're here. So besides an eloquent statement, it's probably too late to do a press conference, but I would love more agitation in our action.
Let me also raise another issue, which is a difficult one, but I think very real. Part of what we face is indifference. Part of what we face is general ignorance. Part of what we face is greed. A lot of what we face is fear. And what the public sees every day is another terrorist attack. And so this is the main motivator or the main support for Trump. Of course, it doesn't stand any analysis. His travel ban on 7 Muslim-majority countries has been rejected by every court because when the court looks at it, they can't find even a glimmer of a rationale in evidence that that ban is related in any way to national security. If they could, they would give the president full deference. But the motivation of the ban, of course, is some combination of generalized hate, but building on fear. And Trump didn't campaign on hate per se, he campaigned on fear. He said, I'm going to stop this migration because it's terrorists. And then every day, the world confronts another terrorist attack. And because we live in one world image now that's completely flat wherever it is, we see every attack everywhere as if it's next door or if it's around the corner. And so also the sense of proportion, the probabilities, the ability to say it's tragic, but this is not the reason to stop normal life, is absolutely part of the mass psychology right now for some people. And we know actually statistically it's inverse to contact, say, with the Muslim people in the United States. Those who have never shaken hands with a Muslim person are the most afraid. They have no experience, no contact, and no relationship. So it's not just heartlessness we're confronting a real phenomenon. And I want to raise that point in terms of ideas, because it's, of course, tapping into stories of wonderful families who have risked their lives is one part of informing a reality, but it's not really informing the driver adequately. The driver is fear. Also, one can say, by the way, I just happened to do a little bit of work on it recently. 9/11 was probably literally is probably literally a case of post-traumatic stress syndrome for a lot of Americans. Watching the towers struck and fall so many times, the psychologists have found actually has had a mental illness toll for many, many Americans. And so we're confronting not just an ideological perception, but we're confronting a media event that has a psychological reality to it as well. So in that context, what ideas are there, both, say, in your program, or what we could do directly on the fear factor, or is that misplaced? Or is there a way to address that in a real way? Of course, that's what the opposition to the court orders, that's what the court orders are literally addressing. So they're showing analytically this is not the right way to go, but how do you get that message motivationally and emotionally that in a country of 325 million people, the United States, it's not a danger to settle tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people. That's not where danger is going to come from. That's a different kind of problem. So I would like people's reflections on that. Please.
I think this meeting here has reminded me of just something that's becoming increasingly evident, and that is how faith communities can play a role in addressing that fear. And I'm certainly, familiar with Christian theologians doing work on theologies of migration, but I also think that there's a number of other examples that came through that are also very important, and I think it could be very valuable just to have some deeper reflection on that, which I think would have a lot of direct pastoral consequences, because I think if we just confront the fear directly, we just get the pushback. If we just go right after the politics, we get the resistance. What I sense happens more and more is how going to the faith narratives gets at the motherboard and really tries to reorient people around this. And even though the bishops in the United States are very clear on this, 60-70% of the Catholics are really on different sides of the fence on this. So, in some sense, education may not seem as a direct consequence or practical consequence, but for me, just to have a gathering to do deepened reflections about how faith communities are informed by migration, shaped by migration, and even challenge these operative narratives.
Great, thank you. Please, Sharif.
Okay, so as I've been listening yesterday and today, I've been thinking, how can we create a win-win situation? A lot of the narratives in the US especially are around this notion of fight or flight, like either you're wrong or I'm right. And so for me, I think both sides are contributing to this notion of fear. And even here, I think, to an extent, we are talking about fear while worrying about fear. And so I think what I want to suggest is that I think we should focus a lot on the positive too from both sides, and how that positive deviance or positive ideology could contribute to overcoming this fear. I mean, from my personal experience, I've lived across the world, and even as a refugee, in Muslim world, and I can tell you it's really great in the US, it's not that bad. And I think that needs to be acknowledged too, and not just simply overlooked. And so in that sense, I think what I would propose is this: there was this quote that energy goes where attention goes. So I think we should focus a lot of our energy on that positive message, and how people can contribute to that positivity. For example, we talked about wealth, how the wealthy are not doing enough. I think what I would like to propose is that we say there is an opportunity for the wealthy to contribute instead of demonizing capitalism, or instead of saying this is all very bad. If we propose that, there is an opportunity, and both could win if only if they contribute. So that would be something I'd highlight.
Please, Virgilio, and then Mohammed.
I would like to pick on Gustavo's point about employment. I think was a very important point, the fact that employment is going down, and a part of the strategy to deal with migration is to create jobs. So I'd just like to relate this discussion that Gustavo raised today to what we discussed yesterday about the need for investments in restoration of degraded ecosystems, because I think this is essential to build resilience in light of climate change. And it is also essential to deal with migration like in Africa, where we discussed the issue of conflicts that derive from climate change. So restoration is, I think, an important component. Number one. Number two is conservation, because we still need to improve the conservation of existing ecosystems. Let's just remind that forests are still being destroyed all over the world, so we need to invest more in the maintenance of these ecosystem services. And finally, a point that oftentimes people refer to environment as only associated with disasters. But we have another process, which is the continuous degradation of ecosystems. Take the case of fisheries, take the case of desertification, soil erosion, and so on. So it's not only the hurricanes and the floods, which are extreme events. We have also a process of continuous degradation of natural ecosystems, which must be tackled. And finally, just a point about Rabbi Jacob's call for some more action. I think your point is very well taken, and maybe, Jeff, what we should do is to have a strategy for communication that is more aggressive, so that the messages that come out of ethics and action is spread in a way that it reaches more people. And as understood, that was your point, and I'd just like to echo that point that I think would be very relevant.
Thank you. Well, I will answer just in one sentence, but I need just 2 minutes to introduce. Dr. Appleby raised a very sensitive issue in his presentation about the relationship between citizenship and religion. The sensitive issue here is where religious solidarity starts and where citizenship rights finish. The second point is where religious beliefs end and where citizenship obligation start. Why I say this? Because the fundamentalist movement in the Middle East, the extremists, raised the slogan that all Muslims are one nation, regardless of their citizenship. From Indonesia to Morocco, they are one nation. Now, this has no foundation whatsoever in Islamic jurisprudence, whatsoever. And the Muslim scholars rejected this slogan and consider it useless, not even to discuss it. But we have to confess that there are some who are following this understanding. And this might explain those terrorists, like the last one in Manchester, that they didn't differentiate between where their citizenship and where religion starts. This is a very sensitive issue. We can't elaborate a lot about it. That's why the sentence I would like to phrase with that it is not religion here that we are concerned with. ISIS and these extremists are not strong with religion. It is strong with our fear. The more we show fear, the more stronger they are. And that's how we should confront it. Thank you.
The subject of the refugees has been mentioned in the World Human Rights Declaration, Article number 13. And this declaration has been accepted and confirmed by all the countries in the world. My suggestion is it would be better that we emphasize on this point that that declaration should be performed, and nobody can be opposed of that. All countries should consider that's a human right for the refugees and immigrant. So today is the day of the law. I suppose if the ethics and morality has not so affection and doesn't affect on some statement, we should emphasize by the language of law. Thank you.
Let me read from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 13 says, everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Article 14 says everyone has the right to seek and to enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. This right may not be invoked in the case of prosecutions genuinely arising from non-political crimes or acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the UN. Article 15 states everyone has the right to a nationality. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his nationality nor denied the right to change his nationality. So these are very appropriate and important points, that this is part of the Universal Declaration and the Moral Charter of the UN, unanimously adopted by all member states.
It's an obligation for all the countries.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is very, very good, very important point. Alberto.
Excuse me, Mr. Sanmak.
Ahí sale, sí. Una cosa menor, pero como el debate era libre, se me ocurre que tengo que plantearlo. Cuando los chicos de los refugiados llegan al país de acogida o llamante, yo propongo, digo, me parece que deben ser escuchados en la escuela sobre el sistema de convivencia, las reglas de convivencia que desean ellos, para escucharlo y ponernos en sus zapatos. Esta experiencia la hicimos en San Luis, en nuestra provincia. El resultado realmente es maravilloso. Los chicos quieren convivir jugando, quieren convivir con respeto, quieren que se cuenten entre ellos las cosas y bueno, me parece muy extraordinario de tener en cuenta este punto. Esta es una cuestión chiquita, menor, si se quiere, pero me parece importante decirlo. Y la otra, que es una cuestión mayor, yo creo que pienso, tal vez sea muy crítico, pero tendríamos que alertar a las Naciones Unidas del fracaso del plan de refugiados. No hay ninguna posibilidad de tener un triunfo política con mayúscula, como corresponde, si no hay un plan. Y el plan tiene que estar adecuado a la realidad. El plan ha fracasado. El sistema propuesto, la ley, ha colapsado. La realidad nos demuestra que es así. Estamos reunidos acá porque esta es la preocupación. Y no hay una respuesta que esté a la altura de los acontecimientos. Entonces, recomendar que se actualice el plan o que se haga un plan adecuado a estos tiempos y que tenga un plazo de solución inmediato, me parece a mí que es algo interesante que debemos preocuparnos. Gracias.
Primero una nota lingüística de lo que acaba de decir el gobernador, muy importante. La palabra convivencia no existe en inglés. No hay una palabra equivalente a la idea de La Mancha, ¿no? del gran imperio lingüístico que eso significó, equivalente a la idea de la convivencia, una idea fundamental. Convivencia. But Jeff, I'm inspired by your thoughts to try another hypothesis. This is on the matter of fear. And let's put a bracket on the current crisis, the catastrophic migrations of the 21st century. And let me try another hypothesis. You sort of make a point of reference, sort of the horrors of 9/11. And it starts with this. No high-income country, and now I'm going to focus on the US and Europe mostly, has done what every high-income country now has to do, which is the transition of an ever more diverse cohort of super diverse populations to much higher levels of citizenship, of the flourishing, the eudaimonic ideal of the Greeks, the flourishing, the connectivity to citizenship, the fundamental idea of John Dewey on the purposes of education, and their transition to the family of the nation. So how much of the malaise, how much of the fear, how much of the anxiety that we're registering has to do with this demographic echo that mass migration over the last 2 generations has generated? We are becoming, in the high-income countries of the world, increasingly super diverse societies. The United States is a case in point. The fastest growing sector of the US child population now is the immigrant origin sector. We live in California, and we've gone through the cycle of fear, trauma, and pain. California today is the 5th largest economy in the galaxy, and it's a minority-majority state. And Pete Wilson, in an earlier era, the former governor, articulated for a few years the collective anxieties and ran a campaign that was extremely focused on the invasion of Mexicans to California. And all of this has meant that the Republican Party has locked itself out of any meaningful role in the running of the most, arguably the most, one of the most important states in the nation. So how much are these, is this a kind of an endless problem moving forward of fear due to the issues that you articulated, Jeff, the fear of terrorism? And how much are the last spasms of a demography that is coming to a forever transition? Take what's going on in Europe. 2/3 of the children that woke up this morning to go to school in Amsterdam, or Rotterdam, and The Hague come from non-Dutch immigrant origin homes. Berlin, 40% of the children that got up and went to schools today come from non-German immigrant origin homes. Paris, about a third of the children that woke up this morning come from non-French immigrant origin homes. So how much is the malaise a kind of a millenarian response to reclaiming Herderian ideal of the unity, the imagined alignment between the territory, language, das Volk, and how much is this a kind of forever rejection of the cosmopolitan sensibility that were the foundations of modernity? How much is the silent demographic shift, to use our colleagues' thought, is a part of the concern, and how much is the punctuated disequilibrium that comes from these catastrophic events like the attacks and so forth?
Both. But the U.S. is very different from the experience of other countries, so you can't use the U.S. as a model that is reflective of other countries, because the U.S., by its history, was an influx of immigrants on a unique scale for all the reasons that we know, whereas many countries are not multicultural. And many countries, that raises another issue, but I think it's a different issue. I believe what is motivating things mostly in the U.S. is fear. Partly it is this threat, this very sharply changing demography, the second factor you talked about. Some countries, Japan doesn't want a lot of immigrants. It's a completely different history, completely different demographics. Northern Europe is debating, are we multicultural or are we Finns, Swedes, Norwegians, Danes? It's quite interesting, by the way, that the Danish Populist Party is a progressive social democratic party in all respects except for one, which says we like our progressive, fair, social democratic party for Danish people. So that's the difference. Not we're right-wing, nasty, Trumpian, grumpy, rich people who want to cut everyone off the payrolls. No, we like our social democracy, but we actually believe that Denmark's for Danish people. So I do think that there's really a difference in life experience in different places in the world. Many countries are multi-ethnic, very like our cardinal to my left here, which is an intrinsic feature of the whole history of Nigeria, and before it was a nation and before it was colonized, hundreds of languages. The United States is the history of a post-ethnic cleansing, mass in-migration of many different ethnicities. Other countries are Herdian nations in some sense. That's how they developed. That's how the borders were drawn to a large extent, with minorities that don't necessarily feel at home. So everybody has a different experience of this set of identity issues. And I think that that's part of our problem, is that we all feel it differently. But I'm making a different point. Fear, definitely, in the presence of daily terrorist attacks, is an issue here. It is. So what do we do about that too, is what I'm trying to get at. How do we address that particular question? Cardinal Rodriguez.
Yes, I have two items, but I rather will speak in Spanish. El primero es lo que usted decía, el miedo. El miedo es una fuerza que paraliza. Y este es un problema grave. La persona que tiene miedo no puede caminar, no puede avanzar. La sociedad que tiene miedo se detiene y busca blindarse para protegerse. pero que ¿de qué sirve una sociedad blindada? Simplemente ahora con la visita del presidente Trump aquí en Italia, yo llegué el propio día, pero un poco más tarde. Ese aeropuerto no era lo que suele ser, era algo blindado y con policías y soldados por todas partes. Todo lo contrario de un país que acoge, que recibe bondadosamente. El miedo es una fuerza de parálisis y el que tiene miedo no avanza. Por eso me encanta esa campaña de UNICEF, Faith Over Fear, la fe por encima del miedo. En la Biblia, la palabra que más se repite es, no tengas miedo, yo estoy contigo. Se repite 366 veces, una para cada día y hasta para el año bisiesto hay una vez. No tengas miedo. Por lo consiguiente, la fe tiene que ser la fuerza para vencer el miedo. Vemos ante estos atentados tan horribles que están sucediendo, la gente trata de responder con fe, muchas veces con una candelita o con un ramito de flores ahí donde fue el atentado. Pero la fe tiene que llevarnos a más, no simplemente a quedarnos paralizados ante el miedo, sino a actuar. Por eso me gusta el nombre de nuestro encuentro de siempre, ética en acción, no paralizada por el miedo. Entonces, es un trabajo difícil, yo lo entiendo, pero el miedo hay que vencerlo. El segundo tema se refiere a lo que decía el doctor Virgilio Viana sobre el cuidado del ambiente. Yo tengo una preocupación muy grande porque después de más ya de 2 años de la publicación de Laudato Si, en muchas partes ha sido ignorada. Y tristemente muchas veces el ambiente laico lo ha estudiado y la trata de poner en práctica más que el ambiente eclesiástico. Y en la jerarquía, lo debo decir con dolor, pero hay sueño, están dormidos. Y bueno, no sé por qué motivaciones, pero es necesario tomar conciencia de esto. Laudato Si tiene que ser la respuesta de la fe a todos estos problemas de la degradación del ambiente y de la naturaleza. Por ejemplo, se necesita, y el Papa lo dice, cambios culturales, y cambios culturales fuertes. Por ejemplo, ¿qué pasa con toda el agua de la lluvia? ¿Qué pasa? Se pierde, se va al océano. Las familias no están habituadas a recoger el agua lluvia. Yo por mi trabajo cuando fui presidente de Cáritas, me tocó recorrer muchas partes del mundo. Y en Oceanía hay islas, naciones que no tienen un solo río, pero no les falta el agua. ¿Por qué tienen esa cultura de recoger el agua lluvia en cisternas para tener agua todo el año? Nosotros, en cambio, se pierde. Se van por los ríos que en tiempo de lluvia parecen de chocolate porque se llevan la tierra y la tierra cultivable se va acabando y las montañas quedan solamente como riscos, pedrería, porque la tierra ya se fue por la erosión. Es un cambio cultural necesario. El agua tenemos que recogerla porque algunos hablan hasta del futuro de la humanidad en guerras por el agua. En segundo lugar, las fuentes de energía. ¿Por qué la energía solar no se ha implementado suficientemente? Parece como una locura. ¿Y qué es lo que dicen las empresas de la energía? Que es demasiado cara. No es cierto. Es que quieren proteger todavía las fuentes de petróleo, porque el petróleo lleva a desaparecer. Tenemos que ser muy conscientes de esto. Y los países muy ricos en petróleo quedan empobrecidos después. Miren a Venezuela. Un país riquísimo, reducido a la miseria. México, que no pudo actualizar la tecnología para extraer el petróleo y tiene mucho petróleo, pero de nada le sirve. Eso va a cambiar. Entonces hay que cambiar culturalmente la mentalidad de la gente y de los empresarios. La energía solar. Es cierto, la primera inversión cuesta, pero después es muy rentable, sumamente rentable. Y luego la energía eólica también. Se ve como un adorno nada más. Qué bonitas aquellas hélices que dicen que ya la nueva tecnología hasta las va a modernizar. Pero ciertamente Laudato Si no se puede quedar dormida y la energía hay que trabajar para un cambio cultural. Gracias.
You mentioned it's an open session. There were just two things I wanted to address. The first one was about the evolutionary biology that you'd mentioned, and there's certainly a lot of evidence. It's something I've been interested in, but I think it's very important, especially for the religious community. When we look at our religions, at the root of all of them, the ideal is universal compassion, the recognition in the stranger of the divine, that God has dignified every human being irrespective of their faith. And I think a lot of religious people tend to forget that because they fall into that clan thinking, the in-group and out-group. And we also have a type of romantic primitivism where a lot of young people view the pre-civilizational world in a nostalgic way, forgetting, in fact, that the in-group morality, which was often quite developed, was actually non-existent towards the out-group very often, and which is why murder was very common, and a lot of our anthropologists have identified that fact. So I think it's really important just that we emphasize that these religions really are about, each one of our religions has an ideal, the saint in the Christian tradition, the wali of God in the Arabic tradition, the Muslim tradition, the Zaddik in the Jewish tradition, the Bodhisattva in the Hindu tradition, the Sannyasi or the Sadhu in the Hindu tradition, Bodhisattva in the Buddhist. And the hallmark of these people is universal compassion. So that was important. And the second thing that I wanted to mention was about Dr. Belize, I think, his comments about transhumanism. Bernard Shaw said that when the end of time came, he wanted to be in Ireland because everything happens 50 years later. But the worst place to be is in California because everything happens 10 years earlier. And I'm in California in the Silicon Valley, and transhumanism is very real. And Google is spending a lot of money on this subject. And Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum brought all the religious leaders together and said, where are your ethicists? Where are you in this? Because things are moving at a very rapid rate, and we need to hear from you. And so I think I'm really glad that that was brought up in this session. Also, Jeremy Rifkin wrote a book a few decades ago called The End of Work. So we are going to have a real crisis that's going to increasingly be exacerbated. And I think the religious communities, the burden is going to fall on us to really be nurturing and helping people understand these massive changes. Thank you.
Professor Sachs, I just wanted to make a quick point on this, your fear that you ask us to think about strategies for overcoming. Clearly, a multi-pronged approach is necessary, but Rabbi Rick also reminded us of the power and the resources that we have right here. And empirical studies establish something that actually works in the overcoming of fear. We have the Pew studies that have been done in the United States and studies in India by political scientists. And what all of these studies reveal to us is that the difference in overcoming the fear of the other is not through knowing about the other, but knowing the other, establishing a deep relationship with the other, looking into the eyes of the other, looking into the face of the other, recognizing a common identity. It requires something much more than simply sharing of geographical space. We have to do something. We have to be proactive in helping to form those relationships. And I think here is where our religious communities can be active. We all have congregations. We have Hindu temples and synagogues and mosques, so that we have an obligation, knowing what we know about how fear can be overcome. We have to see the establishment of interreligious relationships as a fundamental part of what it means to be religious today. We have an obligation to foster, not dialogue at the elite level of experts, and that has its own place, but dialogue and relationships at the level of our communities. So I mentioned just finally the studies in India by the political scientist Ashutosh Varshni. And he was studying in India, why is it that some communities, some cities did not erupt into interreligious violence when even neighboring communities were burning and being destroyed. And he looked at it empirically, and he found that in those communities and those cities which didn't explode in interreligious violence when it was even happening very close, were communities in which people had formed relationships through civic organizations or through interreligious organizations, because you don't destroy someone who is your friend. You know? And so we know this works. And so I just leave it with us. How do we in our religious communities, knowing that this is a fact, what do we do? What are our obligations now to create those communities that are insulated from fear and violence and that can become catalysts for transformation in the larger world?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bob?
Just a comment on fear as the driver of this problem, and what do we do about it. I think we have to ask what makes people vulnerable to fear, and I'd suggest it's loss of hope, it's loss of a sense of being respected, it's a loss of a sense of security, and that list could go on. I mention that because when we focus on the U.S. elections, what tipped the election in favor of President Trump was a strong vote by non-university educated white males. We have to look at what's been happening in that demographic. For 100 years, the life expectancy of every part of the U.S. population has been going up. It's still going up for every segment of U.S. population except that demographic, where since the financial crisis, it's been going down dramatically. And when you look at why, it's for three reasons that public health officials have labeled the diseases of despair: alcoholism, drugs, and suicide. And when you look a little deeper, you see that the family in that demographic is rapidly disintegrating. You see that incomes are falling. And you see that those individuals feel, and I think with great justification, that they have been big losers from globalization and really betrayed by our political and financial elites. So I think there's a depth of despair, and I think it's been compounded by the fact that we good progressives have had certain groups within our circle of compassion, minorities, immigrants, but not the white working class. And I think this election was a wake-up call to good liberals to broaden our circle of compassion to include all people, and around the idea that everyone's pain matters. And I think that We need to go deeper than a simple attribution that this is fear, and I think the gloss we put on that, irrational fear. I think that it doesn't begin to get to the depth of the problem.
Thank you. Please, Ram.
I want to very much echo this last comment and suggest that it be reflected in the statement that's coming out, because when migrants enter a country, not everybody and not every neighborhood are equally affected. So if one issues a statement that simply advocates for the acceptance of more migrants without acknowledging the unequal distribution of the implication and the burden, it's likely to generate a backlash, from those who experience this against people like me who don't experience it directly in my own streets. And this has happened in Israel, and I'm sure it happened in other places. So this is a recipe for political backlash. Often these people are left alone by governments to deal with the situation. And it might, I would like to suggest for your consideration to acknowledge the needs of these people as well in the statement, alongside those of the migrants, and not just to label them as xenophobic or fearful. So I very much agree with that. And just one more quick point on the statement also. I think this term of economic migrants, which is used a lot, sometimes this term is used to portray those migrants as people who are just coming into a country just to make more money. And you see that a lot in the discussion of migration. It doesn't reflect the desperation and deprivation that drives somebody to risk their lives in order to get somewhere. They don't just come to make money. So maybe going out against the use of this term and clarifying that even people who are economic migrants are coming from extreme deprivation and desperation, maybe that's a point worth making in the statement. And finally, just one more thing on the statement. I don't want to repeat myself, but some mention of this abomination of the trip, of what they are going through on this travel. Regardless of how one feels about whether they should be accepted or not, to enable people to go through this ordeal when there are easier ways to get from A to B, it just seems to be something that's morally just unacceptable when there is such a practical alternative, at least for the transport part.
All points taken. By the way, you'll get a Word e-document, everybody, and then you'll put your points into track change. And that way it makes it easier for collating everything and finalizing the draft and making sure that everything is included. Please. I'm going to bring this phase of discussion to an end in the next 2 comments. So you and one more. Jackie.
Thank you very much.
Oh, 3. Okay.
Thank you very much. I wanted to add to the discussion. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to add to the discussion of these 2 days one important element which I think was mentioned, the impact of the increasing inequalities on the whole phenomenon of migration. And I want also to support the point just made by our colleague, that is that it is important also to reinforce the fact that the increasing hostility towards economic migrants should be addressed, because otherwise it becomes a war among disadvantaged people. And I think it is important also to acknowledge that there is an entire pan of the economy which is set around values, which are values of solidarity. And I am referring here to the social and solidarity economy, which is spreading all around our countries, not only OECD countries, but in the whole world, because these entities are really set to produce a social impact, to improve the well-being of individuals and communities, and they really put together, they reconcile two dimensions, the economic one and the social one, which are important to contribute to some sort of inclusive growth and social and shared prosperity, which in the long term could be beneficial also to reduce this migration flows which are originated from the economic crisis. So I would encourage that there is something around this in the statement.
Great. Thank you very much. Jackie?
I want to be I believe, the third person to echo Rabbi Jacob's comments. I would like to ask religious leaders here today to project and show solidarity, and whether that's in the form of a picture or a joint statement of some kind. I have to say that, when we fear, we take comfort in our faith. And for those who do, to see the faiths come together is extremely powerful. So I would like to request that.
Marcelo.
I think that we need...
Microphone.
Sorry. I think that we need to put some point more in our statement, inspired in the things that say the specialist in migration. And this is very simple. Encourage and promote the good practice of humanitarian corridors targeting the most vulnerable asylum seekers and refugees, especially in nations that have space, as today those the governor of St. Louis. That we need to encourage this.
Wonderful. We'll get that.
Yes, I sent to.
Yeah, into the document. Okay, thank you everybody for a wonderful discussion.